So why Kunan Pushpara? And if I got it right from reading the book, that most of you are very young, right? And I think that maybe also some of the writers were not even born. So what made you go into this particular space, into this particular case? And what is very specific and special about these two villages?
So why Kunan Poshpora is a question that we get asked a lot of time. Kunan Poshpora happened back in 1991. It's true that most of us weren't even born, or we were too young to know what was happening around. But Kunan Poshpora is, the atrocities that happened in Kunan Poshpora is talked about a lot. And the reason for that is that the people of Kunan Poshpora kept their struggle alive for 23 years till the PIL was filed for reopening of the case. Kunan and Poshpora, these two villages, the story of these two twin villages have somehow come to epitomize the struggle of Kashmiri women and how the Indian state backlashes on the women and attacks the patriarchy of the society to repress the people, and that's why Kunan and Poshpora. There are a lot of cases of sexual violence in Kashmir, but there is no such case of mass rape and torture in one night in any other village in Kunan Poshpora. There have been other cases, but people have preferred to remain silent about it, to not carry the struggle forward and to not talk about it. But people of Kunan Poshpora they always decided that, on the next day that this happened, they decided that they would fight for justice. And one of the survivors says that they decided to struggle for justice because they did not want this incident to be repeated in other villages. If they had preferred to remain silent, the Indian army would have continued their excesses in other places and raped more women and tortured more men, and they wanted to fight for that. They wanted this to stop. So that is why Kunan Poshpara.
I would love to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. So the first of you introduced the book through your own stories, right? So how, for the writers of this book, you are coming together through this act of writing, through getting to know about Kunan Poshpara, and also there is that element of forgetting, right? That most of you were very young when it happened, and also everyone knows a little bit about these villages, but at the same time it's not like it's talked about every day, even within the kind of the resistance movement. So the way I read the book, that the first chapter is really a story of the co-authors and how they themselves were politicized through this act of writing the book, but then it also becomes a story of the rape survivors, the other women who are coming in contact with you, and the work that you are doing in trying to get the story out, right? So the rape survivors themselves are also breaking their own silences. So there is also another order of politicization that's happening. So and as a writer myself, and as someone who is interested in writing, right? So one of the things that I was extremely struck by, that how writing can bring so many women together. So writing itself becomes a very political act. And how would you actually like to talk about that? How did you actually think of writing, and especially writing as in relationship to women who are placed in an occupied land?
You talked about silence. I'd like to begin with saying that we were all of us, all the co-authors of the book, we were brought up in an environment, in a very secure environment, where our parents didn't allow us to talk much about the politics, or like, for example, our co-author Samreen. She has if you've read the book, she has a very tragic personal story, but her mother never allowed her to talk about her father, who was killed, or all of us, we went to missionary schools, and we had that sort of an education where we were told to be apolitical, to remain away from the politics. Our only aim that we were taught was to get a good education and get a good job for ourselves, and not really ask questions about what was happening outside. I'll tell you my story. I used to ask my father about what's happening. He never encouraged such questions. He never had discussions about politics. Yeah, there were times when my parents would get infuriated about what was happening outside, and they would discuss, but never so much in front of me, because they wanted to keep me secure and away from that. And that sort of an upbringing inculcates in you a culture of remaining silent about what's happening, and not asking questions. But then when you grow up in an environment where you see bloodshed, torture, killings every day, you tend to question, because we're all thinking individuals. We want to know what's happening, why it is happening. And that's something that has shaped our personal journeys, and that has helped us shape our political identities also, because you ask questions, you don't get answers from your from people who immediately surround you, and you turn to books and you look for answers there, and that's how you realize that there is a lot of it's empowering to be with books, and then actually to write about it, because you know so much that you want to give a vent to it. You don't know what else to do, so you write about it. So writing this book has been a very empowering experience for us. Ifra, you want to add to that?
The first chapter of the book, in which we give our introduction, I think that's one of the very interesting chapters in the book, because we had to tell people our stories, how we were brought up in the same environment, but still we somehow had this inculcated in us that we just can't be silent about such things. We have to speak out despite being oppressed. All of us have similar stories, but yet they are different. Every one of us has suffered this suppression by the state, but we somehow came out of it, and this is the platform which we chose to express ourselves and tell others like what is happening to us. So this chapter was very important, and all of us have shared our personal experiences in this introduction part of the book.
And also talking about how it has been empowering for even the victims. They've shared their stories with many people, but they have been passed on as something different. They have been termed as victims, but nobody recognized the fact that they're actually survivors, people who have fought for it. Okay, now victimizing people who are struggling for justice is not really doing justice to them. So when those women narrated their experiences to us, it was a responsibility on our shoulders to actually put it down the way that they wanted. They wanted to be represented as strong women who actually are really fighting the occupation. Those are the real women, and those are the unsung heroes of our struggle for justice and our struggle for independence. So I think it was very, very empowering for us, for the women, and for everybody who was involved in the process of writing the book.
Yeah, which brings me to the next question, which is the idea of writing as collaboration, right? So, and I think that especially if you are in academia, right? You are doing your PhD research. Yes, oftentimes if you're in social sciences, you go to some kind of field, right? And the book, the thesis that comes out of the process, it's still under your name or one author's name. But also the idea of collaboration between your co-authors. So, what did that mean for all of you? That you were not really claiming authorship for any one person, right? But also the collaboration as in taking these repeated trips to these villages, right? Getting the men and women involved, and even children. And I think that that's one of the striking things about the book, that it actually talks about children, that how children, it's not just about the adults, right? That when you have something like a militarized zone, a militarized, very gendered kind of conflict and history of sexual violence, the children are politicized. They are right within the kind of in the middle of the conflict. So what does collaboration mean for you in terms of writing this book? And also what are the challenges that you faced, like any differences of opinion in terms of all the co-authors, but also again, like when you talk about that there have been journalists and media personals who have been to Kunal Pushpara, but at the same time, most of the villagers felt that they came, got their stories, made money out of it. So the question of trust, right, between the five of you and then the rest of the villages.
It's one of the most important things of this book, that the data which we compiled and the interviews which we did, they were not taken in a day or in 2 days. We continuously went to the village. Almost every weekend we went to the village and we discussed the...
And how long have you been going there for?
More than a year. So this was the first time that a group of people went to that village so many times. We discussed the structure of the book with the villagers, and we took everybody with us on board, the men, the women, and the children. The children, they helped us with the mapping of the village. There are images of the maps in the book, and the children, they are usually, people don't talk about them. They are always seen as children who are stigmatized because their mothers were raped, but they have their own stories. Not many people have talked about them. They have not been documented, but we somehow felt their pain, and we thought that they also need to be documented. Their stories need to be written. So there's a chapter which talks about stigma, which talks about how these children were forced to drop out from schools, and we decided collaborative writing. It was five of us decided that we will have separate chapters, and each chapter will have a different theme, so that we can avoid the overlapping. There's no difference of opinion, and everybody gets one chapter so that she is able to focus on that particular topic. Because every chapter is there are different chapters. They're very diverse. The themes are diverse. While one chapter talks about the legal proceedings, other is talking about the social stigma. Natasha's chapter is based on the larger context of the violence in J&K. So every chapter is different, but somehow it connects to the main theme, that's Kunan Poshpora.
Just in terms of talking to you, but also listening to your the talk, like the more formal ones, and both the informal chats and the formal ones. Something I was personally really, I couldn't really, and I think that of all the other stuff, I kind of knew about them as information, right? As news, I wasn't exactly coming from a place where I knew nothing. But something that struck me a lot is this kind of the banning of the student unions, and I think for most of us, our kind of first politicization happened through student groups, through student unions inside of the campuses, and that kind of made me think about that even when from outside we support a movement, we support it almost unconditionally. What are the realities that we cannot have access to as people who are providing solidarity from outside, as well as the life, right? The lives of the people who are right within the occupation. And so far, kind of our readership, I would like you to talk a little bit about, say, your own childhoods and the everyday nature of the occupation. For example, like the banning of the student unions and the stuff that came out like almost in our informal chats, that the banning of the prepaid phones and the numerous other things. So what does it actually mean to actually live in the middle of an occupation?
If I go back to my childhood, I think I would really like to talk about how, when we talk about living in occupation every single day, when you see an armed person outside your home, when you every other lane that you pass by has a big bunker with these dangerous looking men staring at you, asking for your identity cards, checking stuff in your bag. It's very difficult to live a life like that, and we have grown up seeing that. We have had these army walas commenting on us because we were little girls, catching hold of our hands, passing lewd comments on us because they have impunity. They're unquestionable. They have a gun, and you are afraid for your life. That is the reality of living in an occupation every single day. You had these people coming into your homes, ransacking everything, looking for arms where there were none, waiting for doing something retaliatory. So these are things that we have grown up with. I remember I grew up in the city center in Lal Chowk, which was the hub of all political activities always. And I remember there were so many times when I have run for my life, and I've seen people actually being killed when I was very young. So all my memories of childhood are filled with these memories of people getting killed, women wailing, people protesting, shops shutters being coming down in the middle of the day. People going to any place for shelter. It's been very difficult. I remember once there was a time when I was with my father and there was a blast somewhere and I had to run, and we got home really late and my mother was really worried. So that is how we live in an occupation every single day. You go out of your homes in the morning, you don't know whether you will return back safe or not. And no matter how the media likes to portray it right now, saying that things are normal, there is this normalization, there is development in Kashmir, but the reality has not changed. It's dressed in a garb of silence, but the situation is the same. We are living in perilous situation even now. So that's how you go through occupation every single day of your life.
It's very difficult for us to live through this occupation. Being girls, especially, it's more difficult. I also live in the city and very close to the army cantonment, the biggest, in fact, in the Srinagar city. So for me, the first person I see when I come out of my home is an army man with a gun. So that sight is very disturbing. And then the comments, the winks, the strange looks which you get from them, they are even more disturbing. The start of your day happens like this, and you know if you go out from your home, there's no surety that you will come back, or you may get trapped somewhere. And the phones, like you talked about the banning of the internet, the prepaid phones, it's always there. A leader gets killed, we are not allowed to mourn his killing. A militant is killed, we cannot mourn his killing. And then this process continues. There is a killing, there's a funeral, and there's a shootout at the funeral, and there are more killings, there are more funerals, more killings. It continues like that. And this banning of student union, we have never been able to express ourselves at places like colleges or universities. Even if there is a union, you have to be very, very apolitical, and the only things which you can discuss within that union is the problems which you face inside the campus, like your syllabus and all other things. Apart from that, if you ever try to raise your voice against any issue that's happening with you, leave aside solidarity with other parts of state or some other group which you want to support, you can never do that. But you can't even raise your voice against the oppression which you are going through. These unions are never allowed to function there. There was this Kashmir University Students Union, and they had a very small office in the campus. It was ransacked by the police, I think, and it was banned after 2010. But it has been functioning since then, despite being banned. And every time they try to take out a protest inside the university campus, they are showered with bullets and they are beaten up inside the camp. Even the girls, they are beaten up. There are signature campaigns. There was a signature campaign for Afzal Guru when he was hanged. But it's always, these protests they are being showered with lathis. The students are beaten inside the campus, and there's firing inside university campuses. It's very unlikely. You can imagine bullets going on the students inside the campuses.
We recently saw a few months back how infuriated the students at JNU were when they were trying to get the police inside. But we have police in the Kashmir University all the time.
Permanently.
Like there is a permanent posting of police personnel inside the campus, and you can imagine how difficult it is. So they're always waiting for something to happen, and the police will come and take away boys, or they will beat them up, or somebody will come and threaten students. If they try and protest about something that is very political. The gates are shut. The gates are shut. The gates of the university are shut to ensure that no student moves out if there is a protest happening inside the university. You need to get written permissions to express any sort of dissent, and it's a very difficult situation for us there. And like Ifra said, the mobile phones, the prepaid mobile phones were banned for a long time. Right now you see mobile internet is banned because they don't want people to have access to information, but that really doesn't stop what is happening on the streets. Despite giving no access to internet, all of these people are out on the streets and they are protesting, and that only comes to prove how the people feel about being oppressed. It's really not about information sharing and how much access you give to people to the outside world, but it's about people's own sentiments, because there always comes a point where people get fed up of living in an occupation, and then they need to vent it out some way, and people will come out on the streets, and different people will have different ways of expressing their frustration with the state of affairs. for us it's writing, for somebody else it's protesting out on the street, for somebody else it would be video documenting what is happening. So different people have different ways, but that is how we navigate through life every single day, and that is how we try to live the reality of this occupation in the best possible way.
So, following from that everyday nature of the occupation, what comes out is that it's extremely difficult, almost impossible, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the state, right, to keep the memory of both the occupation and the resistance alive. And also your book is called Do You Remember Kunan Ghosh Bora, right? So how would you actually talk about the role that memory plays in, I would say, any kind of struggle against occupation?
See, memory is a very important part of your struggle against oppression. It's your weapon. And the title of the book, Do You Remember Kunan Ghosh Bora? You can imagine from the title that we have to ask each other about such incidents. Do you remember Kunan Ghosh Bora? Do you remember that massacre? Do you remember Tufal Mutu? Do you remember this person? And we have to recall which person you are talking about. Oh, he was killed on that day. Acha, wo massacre. Okay, this rape incident. Because there are so many incidents which have happened since 1989, it's difficult for us to remember all of these. We do remember them, but they are somewhere lost in our memory. We have huge memories. We have hundreds and hundreds of cases, and there's not a single case which we can talk about precedents. There is no such thing called precedents. We just have cases which are pending, which are closed, which are untraced. So memory is our weapon, and it's the only tool which we have. And by remembering these incidents, we are holding the perpetrators. We are trying to remind them that we are not forgetting any of these incidents. They are in our memory, and we will be holding you accountable today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, but you are accountable for your actions. So memory is a very important part of the struggle, and it's because of the memory that we are still fighting this justice struggle and our struggle for freedom. So memory, the day we start forgetting our past, it will be I think it will be the day when our dream of freedom will be dead. It will die a slow death if we start forgetting our past. So we have to make sure that all of these incidents, they are fresh, and we talk about them, not every day, but we have to remember that this incident happened and we are still waiting for justice for this.
And also remembering is important because all these incidents are forming our history, the history of our struggle for freedom. So it's important that we remember these incidents, everything that has happened in the course of this struggle, and we document it and write it down. Document our own histories for the next generation to know what this struggle was all about. So it's very important in the sense that we do not give to the next generation a distorted version of their own history, but history that is true, that is real, that they can go back to and study and see how things had happened. And probably if we don't have freedom by then, they could take the struggle forward. So it's important. Remembrance is the most important tool we have right now. And also, if we start forgetting, it's always convenient for the oppressor. It's complacent. They'll be complacent about the fact that the ones that are being oppressed are not talking about something that has been done to them, and they will be encouraged to repeat such things again and again. So remembrance, memory is the most important tool, like Ifra said, that we have in our struggle right now. If we start forgetting, we lose out on the hope of freedom, or getting away from this oppression.
If you think of kind of the moment from say 1989 to early 90s, I think for those of us in India, right, so who again feel a certain kind of solidarity for the struggle in Kashmir, we have seen a lot of the men who have become the kind of the face of the movement, right?
Yeah.
Beginning from Yasin Malik to Gilani to Burhan Wani. And I'm not talking about the kind of the localized struggles you might have within Kashmir, and you do have, but for us from the outside, we haven't exactly come across kind of women who have become the faces of the resistance, right? And so, and I would kind of, using that, I would like to go back to a lot of the extremely complicated analysis of gender I think that your book is putting forth, right? So one of them is that how the Indian state uses the Kashmiri women's bodies, right? That as a site of violence and as a way to shame the communities, but at the same time that it feeds onto the patriarchy within the Kashmiri society, and kind of your very straightforward comment yesterday, right? That Kashmiri society is extremely patriarchal in itself, and how there is an intersection between the Indian state's patriarchal notions of women's bodies, women's participation, and the Kashmiri patriarchy. But also, what does it mean for women to be in the resistance movement? How does patriarchy operate within the resistance movement? So, kind of along those lines, what do you think about the question of patriarchy and gender and women's role right now within the resistance movement?
There's this writer, Rita Manchanda, who's done an analysis of how women have been part of the freedom struggle and how they've gone through different stages. And I think I agree with her when she talks about that during the early years of the militancy and the armed struggle, women were very active. A lot of women were couriers, but their role was mostly in domestic domains. For example, feeding the militants, working as couriers, taking arms under their burqas, but it was all within certain limits. So women were never really out on the forefront at that point in time. There are some women activists who do talk about women who went to the other side of the LOC for training, but then there is nobody who wants to corroborate these facts for real. So we don't know whether that happened or not. So women were not really part of the militant struggle that way. Like we see in Bastar, for example, where women also take up arms and they're walking shoulder to shoulder with their men and struggling for their rights. But nothing like that happened in Kashmir. So women were a part of. They were behind the scenes. I would say that they are the unsung heroes of the entire struggle, because without the support of the women folk, the men would not have been able to take up such drastic steps as they have, and they needed the support of women. Women were, so many times women were the couriers, so many times they helped feed the militants, or there's so many stories of these women. But then there was a time when the atrocities of the Indian state were below, and then women realized that they are that they're not that empowered in this scenario, and then they don't have to be in the forefront. Incidents like Kulan Poshpura, mass rape of Kulan Poshpura, and there have been so many incidents like Balipura, Pazipura, where women were raped as a retaliatory action to an ongoing encounter that was happening in their village. So incidents like these forced women to be in the backdrop, not come out in the front. And then there came a stage when they decided that wailing of women is a way. But then there was a next stage in the struggle where women did find their own agency. Women like Padmina Ender, who is the chairperson of the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. There is Zamruda Habib, who was jailed, and she's an activist right now. There are many other women who have found their own agency. They've moved from being mere victims to finding their own agency within this scenario. But then if you really talk about women in the early 90s and early 2000s, women weren't really out of the forefront. But now, I think the society is slowly changing, and it's slowly accepting the fact that women do have a political understanding. I was talking about it yesterday also. Especially women of my generation who've seen bloodshed and who've been forced to read about it and have their own political stand, because that we thought was the need of the hour, to know the politics, to have a political stance on something. And that's how women like us also came to the forefront. There are so many other women who are probably not out there on the streets with a sword in their hand, but they are into activism of different sorts. So that's how the role of women is changing. And talking about how the Indian Army has used the patriarchal concept and used the bodies of women to humiliate the entire population. There are so many examples in Pakistan. Kulan Poshpura happens to be the biggest example. Like I just said, the Balipura, Pazipura case. There was an encounter going on in a neighboring village, and these women fled, and they were candidate, and there is this famous thing in a report that says that these army men raped these women by chanting slogans of gender. So that is how they connect, this patriarchal concept and this nationalistic concept, and how women's bodies are used in as a retaliatory action to what it's a punishment. It's a punishment to for being against the Indian state, for fighting against oppression, for saying things that the Indian state doesn't want to hear. So that's how the concept of gender and patriarchy has been used, and it continues to be used. If you look at the recent case of Pulwara girl, where this girl was allegedly assaulted by army personnel, and how the state built this narrative around the character of the girl. So nobody was talking about how this girl was assaulted. Everybody was talking about how this girl was characterless, how this girl had loose morals. A lot of people alleged that this girl was having an affair with an army man. This girl was a minor. Nobody wanted to recognize the fact that she's a minor. And if the army wala is having an affair with the girl, it means the army wala is, she's not the age of consent, right? So you can't have an affair with her. And also it's your protocol. You can't meddle with the civilians. So nobody wanted to talk about how this army wala was, even if he was having an affair with the girl, he was going against his protocols. This girl was a minor. So they use this entire patriarchal and this gender discrimination concept to defame the girl, and they use the fault lines in the society that we have, and that's how this is being used. In the 90s it was different, now it's different, and you can see.
I think it's very important to mention that Kashmiri society is not always patriarchal. We have ancient scriptures from the 6th century, the 11th, 10th century, which clearly show that the society was very open. Women were allowed to move freely, they were given education, and they were taught archery, shooting, and they were given many skills. In fact, in the 10th and 11th century, we had queens who ruled Kashmir. We had Bida and Kota Rani who ruled Kashmir for more than a century. But what changed the society, the structure of the society, was the 1990s. The conflict is the reason that the society became patriarchal. The Indian Army is responsible for that. When the conflict escalated, the sabotaging of the people increased, the acts of violence against people increased. It was that time when women were, it was agreed that they should not be allowed to come out of the home, and even if they come out, they should be completely covered from head to toe. They should have a veil on their faces and things like that. But despite all these restrictions, from both the sides, the militants sometimes said that they had to follow the moral codes of conduct. But what we saw is women came out of their home, they came out on the streets. In the 90s, when the men were picked up randomly and they were held in jails for such long periods, it was women who came out on the streets and did protests. So we saw Kashmiri women covered from head to toe, but they were on streets. And then later on, what forced women to come out was the increase in female-held households. When the male was killed, the female was forced to come out of the house and feed the children. We have so many examples of half widows, those women whose husbands have been disappeared. They were the ones who were forced to come out and search for job avenues because they have a family to feed. So somehow, conflict is also responsible for empowerment of these women. They were forced to come out of their houses and work. It's also important that we accept this fact that the role that women have played has been very obscure. They are not given their right attention. Nobody talks about women who have been role models like Parvina and Zambuda Habib, and maybe Asya Rabi is a role model for some people. She may have a different ideology, but she is a radical Islamist and she claims to be an Islamic feminist. She also has an ideology. Some people treat her as a role model and icon. So there are women we don't talk about. There's APDP's spokesperson Tahira, a very young woman who came from a very far off place from Uri, and she works in the city now. What forced her to come out was that her husband was disappeared and she had 3 sons, and she didn't want them to work as laborers and servants in somebody's home. She came out of her home for them and started working in places went to these people's home and cleaned their dishes and their houses because she had children to feed.
जब हम लोग इधर जो लड़ाई करते हैं ना मूवमेंट में, उनसे जब बात करते हैं तो डेमोक्रेटिक जो पीपल है वो कश्मीर पे इंडियन आर्मी का भी एक्टिविटी है, इंडियन स्टेट की एक्टिविटी है, ये तो मानते हैं। लेकिन बात वहीं आके रुक जाती है कि कश्मीर इज ए इंटीग्रल पार्ट ऑफ इंडिया। उसको छोड़ के आप लोग बोलो कि हाँ स्टेट को ये वायलेंस वगैरह नहीं करना चाहिए, बट इंटीग्रल पार्ट ऑफ इंडिया, तो इन पीपल को आप लोग क्या एड्रेस करेंगे?
People who say that Kashmir is an integral part of India, I would suggest please go back and read the history of Kashmir, and you will know that Kashmir has never been an integral part of India. What circumstances led Kashmir to exceed, like India to exceed in Kashmir, and how all of those things happen. You need to go back to the history and read. A referendum was promised. The Indian Army, when the Indian Army came to Kashmir, it had come only for a short time. India promised a referendum for the people, and so did Pakistan. The referendum was never held, and then India started maintaining that Kashmir is an integral part of India, which automatically meant that there was no question of holding a plebiscite for the people. So I think people who say this, I will suggest this is not something that I can explain in one interview in a few minutes. I think you should go back to some Kashmiri literature and read about it. It's available everywhere. You can Google it and you will find information about it.
I think India के बोलने से that we are an integral part, हम integral part बन नहीं जाते। आप ज़बरदस्ती के यूनियन नहीं बना सकते। There is no similarity between Indians and Kashmiris. Just because 1947 में the king asked for help from the Indian government, लोगों ने तो मदद नहीं मांगी थी ना। And nobody knows what people wanted actually. It was the Dogra ruler who asked for help. And Indians, they deceived him. Madad ke bajai, he was forced to sign an instrument of accession first. And there was this demand कि जब तक sign नहीं होगा हम troopers नहीं भेज सकते हैं। अगर मदद ही करनी थी तो what was the need for signing of the instrument of accession? उसकी तो ज़रूरत नहीं थी ना। So that means somewhere they knew कि अगर इस पे sign हो गया, then they are bound. उसके बाद ये वापस नहीं जा सकते। So it was like धोखा दिया, it was a deception.
The resolution that UN passed in 1948, which has not been,
And
state is not
you
does
always
not want to follow
discuss
it.
this issue as bilateral, India, Pakistan, bilateral. It's not bilateral. We are the people who have to decide for ourselves. We have to get that right. Let us decide. Let we tell India and Pakistan what we want. They cannot decide on our behalf. I mean, it's our nation. We have to decide हमें कहाँ जाना है. You cannot decide on our behalf.
And also the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream political parties and the political leaders do not necessarily represent the aspirations of the Kashmiri common man. So when we talk about having all of these PDP leaders and National Conference leaders talking to Delhi and to Pakistan, they don't represent the aspirations of people like us, of ordinary Kashmiri common people. So there are a lot of people who say that आपकी political parties जाती हैं, they talk to Delhi and they talk to Pakistan. We don't trust that process. We don't believe in that process. So we believe हमें justice तब मिलेगा कश्मीरियों को when we get the chance to decide, when every common Kashmiri man gets a chance to speak out for himself, not through political parties, because they don't really represent us and our political aspirations.
I would actually like to go back to the question of gender a little bit. And something that you said, that how the domestic domain becomes so important, right? In terms of the state sending the women, the Indian state sending the women back to the kind of the domestic space, but also the resistance movement, the initial days, right? That it almost forces women to stick to this very domestic roles even when they are trying to be political, like being couriers, feeding the militants and all of that. And I guess that globally, if you think of women and their relationship to the domestic space, it is a complicated relationship, right? And one of the complexities is that women are, there is this kind of almost quote-unquote natural relationship between women and domestic space that's made in every society. But at the same time, the fact that the women are in the domestic space, that sometimes give them a little bit of a space, right, to maybe think about certain questions. And again, reading most of your own stories, most of you talked about books, right? That I was not, then I came back to the books, then I read this novels. So the books, I see, at least the way you have represented yourselves, books have played a really important role. And I would say, if I extend the books to even something like social media, so texts in general.
Yes.
So what role has books and social media and writing and making of texts have played a role in the politicization of women, and especially kind of the women of your generation in Kashmir?
See, books and social media, these literary spaces, they have, I think we have started going to these mediums from late 2000, I think, early from 2000. This was the time when we started to read about our own histories. But till then, people usually, they discussed the issue within themselves, but there were not much books, and social media was not there. So I think that social media has been used by the people for spreading the message of resistance, and that's the reason the state bans it from time to time. Whenever there is an uprising, it's the first thing that's banned by the state. And mobile internets are particularly banned because youngsters are using this mobile internet, they use it, and it's available with everybody, and the message is spread so fast, it has become a threat for the state. So they ban it immediately. And the way people use it, the young generation uses it, it's going to help in the struggle. I think definitely it will help us in spreading our message to not just people from India but the whole world. Everybody is connecting to us, and we also connect with other people through this. We also express our sympathy to people who are suffering in other parts of the world, like Palestine, Syria, Yemen. We express their solidarity with us, and we have seen these people, they also express their solidarity. People from Germany, Spain, even these days when there is this uprising in the valley, lots of people from international media, they are expressing their solidarity with us. And in fact, even today, the UN has also expressed, and they have also said that whatever is happening in Kashmir is very condemnable.
Yeah, and I think for people, especially of our generation, books, literature is very important. We come from a generation where most of the people are educated. They can read and they can write. And so this is a tool in their hands. And when you read and write, you ask more questions. You get more antagonistic towards the oppressor, the Indian state. And this is something that I personally believe also the reading, writing and literature has also helped in probably what happened in JNU, because there were students who read, who wrote, who went to, students who go to universities across India and across the world, Kashmiri students. And then they have read on their own histories, and then they interact with other people who in turn get to read more stuff about Kashmir, and then the message spreads. And I think that's why I think literature and books has helped the cause. It has helped.
Yeah, and this is kind of the last question. So, and something that we have been kind of talking about more in a kind of lighter tone yesterday, right? The stereotype of the Kashmiri we get in films like Haidar and in Bollywood. And as against that, I mean, I think that if you talk to most people, especially about the tradition of women's writing in Kashmir, most of the Indians would not know about someone like that, right? So this, on the one hand, the popular blindness about Kashmir, which is oftentimes fueled by Bollywood, right? So if you can address that a little bit, but also about the literary traditions in Kashmir, and that will, what does literature mean, and what are the, and if so for someone who is starting, say, an 18 to 21-year-old who is interested in knowing about Kashmir and wants to get his or her inroads through Kashmiri literature, what would be some of the books that you love and you would recommend? But also, and also the women's writing, right? That what does it? How has women's literature has flourished in Kashmir? What's the tradition of women's writing?
I think it's very important to mention that Kashmiri women have always been more empowered than their counterparts in other parts of South Asia. Kashmiri women have had more say in what happens in the family decisions, and there was a time when Kashmiri women never observed Parda. In fact, You will see Kashmiri women not covering their chests. If you go to rural areas, you will see that they still have that style of dressing. You know, they will just have something to cover their heads, but nothing to cover their chests. And women in Kashmir have always they've been farmers. So when you go to the field, you need to roll up your salwar to your knees and get into the field. And they've done that along with the men. So there has not been that sort of a parda or restriction for the women. They have been contributors to the family income just the way that men have. The only thing is that it does go unrecognized like in most part of the world, but in terms of empowerment and having a say, Kashmiri women have always had that. Going on from this stage to the other, there have been a lot of Kashmiri women who have shaped the histories and who have had a lot of influence on the culture and literature of Kashmir, more than men. That is one is, as you mentioned, Lalden. Her writings and poems are still celebrated across Kashmir. They are very typical Kashmiri, which even people from our generation don't really understand without help from somebody else. There has been this poetess called Habba Khatun. There have been a lot of women who have been very influential in shaping the culture. Habba Khatun mentions, and both Lalden and Habba Khatun talk about gender discrimination way back. And you know, if you really read, if you're able to read their texts and interpret it in the current context, you will see that they have been very empowered ideas. In terms of a lot of feminists question those kind of gender discrimination now, but they've been talking about it way back. So if there has been, she has been researching about it, and she will be able to tell you more.
You told me about how women from the 6th centuries to early 19th centuries have been able to carve this space in every sphere of life, political, social. But you just mentioned about Bollywood movies. I think it's very important that we tell you that whatever is shown in Bollywood movies, definitely the situation is not like that. The women, they are not all of them are like what they are shown as with their pronunciations. Natasha is
it's about like I always tell people when I saw the movie Haider, I was very disappointed to see a lot of things in the movie. Although the movie is very close to reality in terms of disappearances and how people crack down and burning down houses and all of that. But then it really doesn't show the real Kashmir. It also builds on the same narrative that the Indian state wants to propagate. And one of the things that I found really distressing was the fact that when Shraddha Kapoor and Shahid Kapoor are having this romantic moment in the movie and he says, "I loved you," mispronouncing the word love. I'd say English is not our first language. That's important to mention. Our first language is Kashmiri. But even then, not all Kashmiri women would mispronounce words. Especially if how it is shown in the movie that Shraddha Kapoor is a very empowered journalist. She's just out there. She's one of those fearless women in the movie. So we wouldn't expect somebody like that to mispronounce words. That is a stereotype that is created by Bollywood, and that you know it just serves people's understanding to say that Kashmiri women are not that educated or they don't know about what's happening around. But that's not the reality. We find it really funny. In fact, it's a joke that we share. You know, it's like, so you are mispronouncing the word love it because we don't really talk like that. And people who do have that sort of an accent is their accent. So we don't make fun of people because of their accents. Like it was indirectly shown in the movie. And Bollywood does try and create the stereotype of the women who's always clad in a hijab, who's always wearing a burqa and probably carrying arms under a burqa. We don't wear hijab, yet we are as Kashmiri as any other Kashmiri woman. We don't really carry arms. We don't have pistols and grenades in our bags. We have books in our bags. And we carry chocolates and chips in our bags, just like any other girl in India. And we share the same interests. We are not really how Bollywood portrays us. We do come out of our homes. We do like to travel, we do like to talk about stuff, we do like to interact with people on the social media. We actually, all Kashmiri women like to do everything that women like to do, anywhere in the world. Everybody has different interests. Somebody would be interested in makeup, somebody would be interested in books, somebody would be interested in traveling and gossiping. All women, like all things that all normal human beings love. And also Kashmir is not just black and white. it's not black and white as shown in all movies. We have a lot of colors. Yes, we are living in an occupation. We are an oppressed society, but we know we have learned how to live with it. It's important to keep some humor alive when you are dealing with an occupation, because how else would you be able to fight the occupation if you don't keep some humor alive? So Kashmiris know how to do that. We have a lot of, we crack jokes. We love to go out with our family and friends. It's not just black and white. We live a normal life, and usually people expect activists like us to be very gloomy all the time. We are not. There was we were protesting for the Hanwara girl, and outside the press enclave in Srinagar, and we sort of happened to share one joke. It was a serious thing, but we sort of happened to share one joke, and one of the journalists came and said, "You girls are shameless. You don't realize that you were protesting for something so serious." And you were laughing, and then all of the newspapers had that one picture of us circulating where we were smiling, and all people had all sorts of comments flowing in. But it's important for people to know, you just cannot stereotype anyone in this world. Just because somebody is an activist and going out there protesting for something that is very serious doesn't mean that they don't have a life and they don't smile and laugh. So it's not just black and white. Our lives are not black and white. Our lives are also colorful, and yet we struggle every single day. And because our lives are interesting is how we get the encouragement to struggle and to fight this occupation every single day. Without a little bit of humor, we would not be able to do that. So take it as it is, stop stereotyping us.
Who amongst the contemporary Kashmiri writers should we read?
Contemporary Kashmiri writers,
I think you should go in the history first. There are some books which describe the history. There is Premnath Bazaz,
Yeah,
he has
there's
written a lot
Premnath
of stuff on that. There's PMK Bhamzai who has written, and there's A.G. Noorani who has also written some books. And then we have the feminist perspective. We have Urvashi's books, Rita Manchanda, Navneeta Chadda, and what else?
there is. If you want to read about women, there are books of anthologies of Lal Ded and Habba Khatun's poems translated into English. We also read the same English translations because we can't really read Kashmiri, so that would be interesting reads. There are books on Lala Rukh, books on Rabia Basri, who have been important figures in Islamic and Kashmiri history. So you could read that if you really want to understand Kashmir and its culture. And there are lots.
Lots of budding journalists who are also very active, and they are writing.
There is Zamuda Habib's book, Prisoner Number 100, which is a very interesting piece of work, and that would be there. What is your subject? What do you teach?